Hey guys, it's Ellie. Welcome back to Bite-Sized Book of Mormon. I'm glad to have you with me. So, if you've never been here before, this is just a podcast where I read through one chapter of the Book of Mormon each episode, and I give a little bit of context, a little bit of insight, a little bit of good times, so stick around. So, if you remember last episode, we read Mosiah chapter 6, which is a pretty brief chapter. It's only 7 verses, but it went over a little bit more of the wrap-up of King Benjamin's address. So, he officially anointed his son as king, so now he's just Benjamin as opposed to King Benjamin, and now we have a new king, Mosiah. And he also talks about how he appointed priests to help the people hear and know of the commandments of God, which I thought was pretty cool, and so on and so forth. So go back, listen to that if you haven't already. But yeah, I think without further ado, we move on to Mosiah chapter 7, and the reign of King Mosiah. And it came to pass that after King Mosiah had had continual peace for the space of 3 years, he was desirous to know concerning the people who went up to dwell in the land of Lehi-Nephi, or in the city of Lehi-Nephi. For his people had heard nothing from them from the time they left the land of Zarahemla. Therefore they wearied him with their teasings. And it came to pass that King Mosiah granted that 16 of their strong men might go up to the land of Lehi-Nephi to inquire concerning their brethren. And it came to pass that on the morrow they started to go up, having with them one Ammon, he being a strong and mighty man, and a descendant of Zarahemla, and he was also their leader. And now they knew not the course they should travel in the wilderness to go up to the land of Lehi-Nephi. Therefore they wandered many days in the wilderness, even 40 days did they wander. So it's interesting how in verse 4 it says that they wandered for 40 days, because that rings very biblical, does it not? Like, Jesus fasted for 40 days, the people of Israel wandered for 40 years in the wilderness, and biblically that just kind of means a long time, or like essentially forever. Like 70 times 7, when Jesus is like, you should forgive people until 70 times 7. It's like, that is a distinct number, but also, especially in this biblical context, it just means forever, you know, because it's just such a big number. So it's interesting then that that biblical number seeps in to the Book of Mormon, because we don't really see that very much. So it's interesting because this shows that they do have a shared heritage with those that wrote the Old Testament, and therefore told stories of Moses and Abraham and, you know, all the stories that have the number 40 in them, and that they have that Jewish understanding of the world just a little bit, you know? Like, obviously it's been decades since they left, but there is still a little bit of that Jewish understanding in their culture. Just a little bit, which is super interesting to see in little things like this. And when they had wandered 40 days, they came to a hill, which is north of the land of Shilom, and there they pitched their tents. And Ammon took 3 of his brethren, and their names were Amaleki, Helam, and Hem, and they went down into the land of Nephi. And behold, they met the king of the people who were in the land of Nephi, and in the land of Shilom, and they were surrounded by the king's guard, and were taken, and were bound, and were committed to prison. So what's so exciting about this chapter for me, just quick pause, is that this is the first truly narrative chapter. Before, we have some narrative, but mostly King Benjamin's address, and then before that, in the small places of Nephi, it was basically all preaching with a little bit of, like, historical recap on the side, but this is telling a story. And so we have people in the land of Zarahemla looking for their brethren that left the land of Lehi-Nephi, who knows how long ago, and they're leaving, and they have someone named Ammon leading them, and they just found the land of Nephi, and they've been tied up and taken to the king. So, what will happen? This is the first chapter where it truly feels like I'm reading you guys a storybook, and that is so much fun, so buckle up, I guess. And it came to pass that when they had been in prison 2 days, they were again brought before the king, and their bands were loosed, and they stood before the king, and were permitted, or rather commanded, that they should answer the questions which he should ask them. And he said unto them, Behold, I am Limhi, the son of Noah, who was the son of Zeniff, who came up out of the land of Zarahemla to inherit this land, which was the land of their fathers, who was made king by the voice of the people. And now I desire to know the cause whereby ye were so bold as to come near the walls of the city, when I myself was with my guards without the gate. And now for this cause have I suffered that ye should be preserved, that I might inquire of you, or else I should have caused that my guards should have put you to death. Ye are permitted to speak. And now when Ammon saw that he was permitted to speak, he went forth and bowed himself before the king, and rising again, he said, O king, I am very thankful before God this day that I am yet alive, and am permitted to speak, and I will endeavor to speak with boldness. For I am assured that if ye had known me, ye would not have suffered that I should have worn these bands. For I am Ammon, and am a descendant of Zarahemla, and have come up out of the land of Zarahemla to inquire concerning our brethren, whom Zeniff brought up out of that land. And now it came to pass that after Limhi had heard the words of Ammon, he was exceedingly glad, and said, Now I know of a surety that my brethren who were in the land of Zarahemla are yet alive, and now I will rejoice, and on the morrow I will cause that my people shall rejoice also. For behold, we are in bondage to the Lamanites, and are taxed with a tax which is grievous to be borne. And now behold, our brethren will deliver us out of our bondage, or out of the hands of the Lamanites, and we will be their slaves. For it is better that we be slaves to the Nephites, than to pay tribute to the king of the Lamanites. That is such an interesting, thought process, where King Limhi is like, so we're being enslaved, basically, by the king of the Lamanites, because we have to pay them these wild, expensive tributes. So if you free us, we can be slaves to the Nephites, which is better than slaves to the Lamanites. I'm like, whoa. Do you think you're just going to be enslaved for the rest of your life? Do you think the Nephites want to enslave you? Is that just how you see the world now, because you've been enslaved for so long? That's so sad. So this is such an interesting perspective and such an interesting character that we meet. And this is, in fact, one of the first characters that we meet that's not like a prophet or a missionary or a preacher, you know? He's just a king, and he's worried about his people. And they're enslaved, and so they want to not be enslaved anymore. So this is really interesting to get like a different, perspective on the culture. Because so far, most of the perspective of the culture that we've had is through a religious lens, but this is through more of a practical lens. Because he's like, well, it's better that we're enslaved to the Nephites than to the Lamanites, because I am a king of my people, and I do what's best for them, and that is what is best for them. So, anyways, super interesting, different priorities than we usually get. And now King Limhi commanded his guards that they should no more bind Ammon nor his brethren, but caused that they should go to the hill which was north of Shilom, and bring their brethren into the city, that thereby they might eat and drink and rest themselves from the labors of their journey, for they had suffered many things. They had suffered hunger, thirst, and fatigue. And now it came to pass on the morrow that King Limhi sent a proclamation among all his people, that thereby they might gather themselves together to the temple, to hear the words which he should speak unto them. And it came to pass that when they had gathered themselves together, that he spake unto them in this wise, saying, O ye my people, lift up your heads and be comforted, for behold, the time is at hand, or is not far distant, when we shall no longer be in subjection to our enemies, notwithstanding our many strugglings, which have been in vain. Yet I trust there remaineth an effectual struggle to be made. Therefore lift up your heads and rejoice, and put your trust in God, in that God who was the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and also that God who brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, and caused that they should walk through the Red Sea on dry ground, and fed them with manna, that they might not perish in the wilderness, and many more things did he do for them. I always absolutely love it when the Book of Mormon references the Bible, and they do it all the time, because, again, these are an Abrahamic people. These are Jewish people, heritage-wise, and so they have those stories from the Old Testament, and it's so fun when they talk about them. Like, Nephi talks about them a bunch, he references Moses a few times, and then we have quotes of Isaiah from Nephi later on, and constant references to what God did for the people of Israel throughout the whole Old Testament. And it is so fun to see because it really drives home the point that these scriptures are not isolated silos. Even in ancient times, these scriptures taught the people. They changed people's behaviors. They, taught them about God and about how he works and how he communicates with his people. And so when we think sometimes of scripture, I think that sometimes we think, okay, it got written down, super long ago, got written down thousands of years ago, but then now we have it today and now we're reading it as scripture. When in reality, these writings have been read continually since they were written down. Especially the Old Testament, they're so old. But the Book of Mormon is an exception because it was literally buried in the ground. But the Old Testament was continually read, and so it's so cool to see how it interacts with these people, and references to it get enshrined in other scripture. Anyways, that is just a huge nerd thing, because, Scripture is a web, Scripture is not these siloed books or these siloed accounts of Jesus. It is all connected, as people are, because it was written by people. And again, that same God has brought our fathers out of the land of Jerusalem, and has kept and preserved his people even until now. And behold, it is because of our iniquities and abominations that he has brought us into bondage. And ye are all witnesses this day that Zeniff, who was made king over this people, he being overzealous to inherit the land of his fathers, therefore being deceived by the cunning and craftiness of King Laman, who having entered into a treaty with King Zeniff, and having yielded up into his hands the possessions of a part of the land, or even the city of Lehi-Nephi, and the city of Shilom and the land round about, and all this he did for the sole purpose of bringing this people into subjection or into bondage. And behold, we at this time do pay tribute to the king of the Lamanites, to the amount of 1/2 of our corn and our barley, and even all our grain of every kind, and 1/2 of the increase of our flocks and our herds, and even 1/2 of all we have or possess the king of the Lamanites doth exact of us, or our lives. And now is this not grievous to be borne? And is not this our affliction great? Now behold, how great reason we have to mourn. Yea, I say unto you, great are the reasons which we have to mourn, for behold, how many of our brethren have been slain, and their blood hath been spilt in vain, and all because of iniquity. For if this people had not fallen into transgression, the Lord would not have suffered that this great evil should come upon them. For behold, they would not hearken unto his words, but there arose contentions among them, even so much that they did shed blood among themselves. Imagine an enemy force occupying your land and taking tributes of you for half of everything you own. Like, you think tithing is bad? That's 10% of your monetary increase. Half of everything? Of course they hate being enslaved to the Lamanites because they take so much. That is wild. And then if they don't pay that, they kill the person who doesn't pay. These people have had so many friends and family members die, I'm sure, just because they physically could not give up half of their food because they had to feed themselves or their family. That is not a good state to be in. So of course they're quote-unquote mourning, as they say. And a prophet of the Lord have they slain, yea, a chosen man of God, who told them of their wickedness and abominations, and prophesied of many things which are to come, yea, even the coming of Christ. And because he said unto them that Christ was the God, the Father of all things, and said that he should take upon him the image of man, and it should be the image after which man was created in the beginning. Or in other words, he said that man was created after the image of God, and that God should come down among the children of men, and take upon him flesh and blood, and go forth upon the face of the earth. And now because he said this, they did put him to death, and many more things did they do, which brought down the wrath of God upon them. Therefore, who wondereth that they are in bondage, and that they are smitten with sore afflictions? For behold, the Lord hath said, I will not succor my people in the day of their transgression, but I will hedge up their ways, that they prosper not, and their doings shall be as a stumbling block before them. So right now we're learning through Limhi basically the history of this people, how they were enslaved by the Lamanites, and they credit it all to their wickedness. They say, well, if we weren't wicked, if we didn't transgress, if we didn't kill a prophet of God, then this affliction would not have come upon us. Then we wouldn't be enslaved by the Lamanites in such a way. And it's really interesting because in this chapter, they're talking about Abinadi and King Noah and that whole shenanigan. And that happens later in the Book of Mormon. We read about that in the following chapters. Because if you remember from earlier, it was King Zeniff that took the people out initially to go to the land of Lehi Nephi, and then King Noah, and now King Limhi. But King Noah is the one that ordered Abinadi, the prophet of God, to be killed. And that is a story that we're gonna read later. This is such a fun thing of the Book of Mormon, is that sometimes, not very often, but sometimes things are written out of order. And so you see references to stories that have already happened in the chronology, but we haven't read yet. And it's so fun to see how they talk about it, because usually we don't get people's thoughts or impressions of an event that happened in the past, because usually we just hear the story and then we move on. But now we're hearing people talk about a story that we haven't even read yet, and then we read it. And so it's interesting that we get people's impressions of a story. In this case, they regret killing a prophet of God because now they see that his words were true, and now because of their transgression, they're enslaved. And so it's really interesting to see kind of the consequences of an event before you even read about it, you know? This is so fascinating. I love it so much. And again he saith, If my people shall sow filthiness, they shall reap the chaff thereof in the whirlwind, and the effect thereof is poison. And again he saith, If my people shall sow filthiness, they shall reap the east wind, which bringeth immediate destruction. And now behold, the promise of the Lord is fulfilled, and ye are smitten and afflicted. But if ye will turn to the Lord with full purpose of heart, and put your trust in him, and serve him with all diligence of mind, if ye do this, he will, according to his own will and pleasure, deliver you out of bondage. So we love a good turn to the Lord teaching, as we know. We are very familiar with that in this podcast. I talk about turning to the Lord all the time, like at any opportunity, because I think that that is the ultimate purpose, the ultimate test of life, is what do we do when we are struggling? What do we do when we don't know what else to do? We turn to God. And if we do so, that is discipleship. And obviously there are levels of discipleship. There's good, better, best. But turning to God is the first and most important, in my opinion, step of discipleship. Is just choosing, making that choice to turn to him when you don't know what else to do. Or when you're lost. Or when you're confused. Or when you're angry. Obviously easier said than done, but it is a very important thing to do. So, like I've already mentioned, I really love this chapter because it's so narrative. Like, it takes you through a story. You see people in the land of Zarahemla being like, hey, we want to go see what the people of Zenith are doing. And then they go, they take the party, and then we read as they're tied up by the king's guards, and they're taken in front of the king, and then they talk, and then King Limhi realizes who they are, and frees them, and then rejoices with the people that their freedom is here, and then they preach a little bit. And then we learn a little bit about their history and about how they got to where they are and how they messed up in their past. And that is now coming back to bite them because they killed a prophet of God. And so it's super cool that it's so chronological and it's so narrative. And that's partially why I really love the Book of Mormon, is because it has a lot of this. Like, obviously, the other books of scripture do as well, but this has so much of it. And it's so cool. And like I've already mentioned, I love getting into the nitty-gritty of like, oh, like this king that precedes Limhi is actually King Noah, and that is the King Noah that killed Abinadi, and now it's like coming back to bite them in this order, and Zenith may have left Zarahemla before the Nephites got there, we're not sure. But if they did, that's pretty cool, because then they'd go back and they'd see a whole different Zarahemla. Anyways, I love getting into the nitty-gritty. That's why I talk about it so much, because it's so interesting, and it really brings the book alive, because it helps you see the people that wrote it. Like, there is a whole world that this book just gives us a glimpse into, and I love it when we can see a little bit more of that world. And anyways, it's cool. It's very fun. And so get ready to read a lot more chapters in a similar format to this that are just narrative, and through the stories and the events that happen teach you lessons instead of directly teaching principles of the doctrine. So it's a different mode of learning, but I love it just as much, if not more, than the pure doctrine that we get from the other prophets. As we read these narrative chapters, keep in mind that everything in this Book of Mormon, especially in the large plates, which we are in now, has been curated by Mormon. So every story has a purpose for existing, and every story has a lesson that Mormon thinks we can learn. And sometimes he peeks his head in and tells us what he thinks we can learn, where he says, and thus we see, and then he says a little moral for the story, but not always. So keep in mind that these aren't just stories, these are stories with purposes and meanings and lessons. Just like parables, but different. So the standout verse for today is going to be verse 19, which says, therefore lift up your heads and rejoice and put your trust in God, in that God who was the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and also that God who brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, and caused that they should walk through the Red Sea on dry ground, and fed them with manna that they might not perish in the wilderness, and many more things did he do for them. So I already talked kind of about the second part where King Limhi is talking about the people of Israel and some Old Testament stories and like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I want to talk now about the first part where it says, therefore lift up your heads and rejoice and put your trust in God. Because it's interesting because he follows this with several verses of saying, this is how we screwed up. This is why we're being afflicted by God. We killed a prophet. We were wicked. We weren't listening. And now we're being, afflicted by God because of that. But before all of that, he prefaces it by saying, trust in God, lift up your heads and rejoice. Because there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Because, the people from Zarahemla, led by Ammon, came, and they're going to save them. And so they see, like I said, a light at the end of the tunnel, and they see an end to their afflictions. But I think in our lives we can do one better than King Limhi's people did. They're rejoicing because they have a reason to hope that they will be taken out of their afflictions. But in our lives, I think that we can hope and rejoice and trust in God even when we don't have that light at the end of the tunnel, even when we don't see an end to our afflictions or see an end to our struggles. And obviously, it is a very hard thing to do, to be happy and to trust and to rejoice when you see nothing but darkness all around you and you find no way out of your struggles or your afflictions. But there is a way, and it will happen, and trusting in God and finding hope in His gospel is a very strong way to give yourself that foundation of hope and rejoicing that can help you get out of whatever you're struggling with. So I guess the lesson for today is hope and trust in God, even if you don't see an ending to your struggles like the people of Limhi do at this moment. So, I think that's the episode for today. Thank you so much for listening. I love having you around listening to my crazy Book of Mormon ramblings. So there's just some links down in the show notes that I want to go over super fast. So the first three are 3 different versions of the Book of Mormon. One is a web version, and the other 2 are different app versions of the Book of Mormon. They're all free, obviously. So you should definitely read along, because the Book of Mormon is pretty cool. Anyways, next Thursday, let me know you learned a link. So if you want to send me a message, whether it be feedback about the podcast itself, what you like or don't like, or something that you're nerding out about that I didn't mention, or maybe that I did mention and you want to co-nerd out about it with me. So you can message me there at that link. There's also a quick support the show link, so if you want to shoot me a few bucks, support what I do, you can. It's down there. And finally, we're on YouTube, so if you want to listen to the podcast on YouTube, that is a viable platform, and look forward to some potential extra little tidbits on there, because despite being a busy college student, I still find time to make content, because that's what I love to do. So, anyways, that's all I got for you today. I'll talk to you later. Bye!